Hello, it's Scott Manley here. Now, one of the questions I've been asked a great deal in recent months is, what is my opinion of the Scottish independence referendum? If you don't know, this is a referendum which will decide whether Scotland remains part of the United Kingdom or not. It's open to residents of Scotland aged 16 and older, and as such, I am not eligible to vote because I've spent the last 10 years living in California. I grew up in Scotland. I spent most of my life there, explaining my accent, but I do not live there anymore, and therefore I am not allowed to vote in this referendum. But I think it would be kind of interesting to go back and tell the story, or at least explain the history of how Scotland became part of the United Kingdom. And it's quite an interesting story, very complicated, a lot of succession wars and things like that, let's say. But yeah, if you go back into distant past, before recorded history, Scotland was inhabited back when Britain was actually part of a peninsula during the Ice Age when the sea levels were lower. There's evidence of people doing things in Scotland. One of the oldest archaeological sites in the world is Skara Brae in the Orkneys. It's a Neolithic settlement that's something like 5,000 years old or something like that. And but no recorded history of Scotland exists until the Romans come along in about 100 BC, and they start colonising England and in Britain in general, trying to convert it to part of the Roman Empire. Now, at some point, they clearly decided it wasn't worth it because the rain was too bad or the locals were too hostile, and Emperor Hadrian built a wall across Britain, locking off one side, which was inhabited by the Picts, or the Picti as they called them, the painted ones, basically the Scotland. They were not well liked by the Romans, presumably, which is why they built a wall to keep them out. Now, the Roman Empire only lasted for 500 years or so in Britain, and eventually it faded away and the locals kind of got their autonomy back. And what happened? Well, you ended up with a bunch of warlords fighting each other over territory. And these territories eventually would grow over time through alliances and diplomacy. In Scotland, you ended up with two major groups. You had the Picti and the Scoti, and they were largely split along religion. The Picti were pagans, pagan Celtic mythology or whatever, and the Scoti were Celtic Christianity. And these guys, of course, they continued their fighting, and then the Vikings come along. Now, the Vikings ended up kind of representing a common foe, and the two groups who had been mortal enemies, through a bit of diplomacy, a bit of military action, and through the threat of a common foe, eventually formed together into the nation of Alba, united under Kenneth MacAlpin, the first king of Scotland. So his family continues to rule Scotland for many, many years to come. As a king, the monarchy is passed down through the children, and specifically the male children are given priority. So this is kind of important in later years. Now, it continues for a few hundred years until towards the end of the 13th century, when there is a succession crisis where the king dies and there are no legitimate heirs, or there's no obvious heirs. There's a number of people who have family links to the throne, and they all want their piece of the action, but they are all prepared to go to war about this. And having a civil war is not good for your nation. It tends to reduce your productivity and things like that. So the lords, they go to their neighbour, England, and they ask Edward I to pick the legitimate king of Scotland. Now, the two obvious ones are John Balliol and Robert the Bruce, and Edward I backs John Balliol and makes him pledge allegiance to Edward I. Now, Edward I is kind of portrayed as the bad guy during the Scottish Wars of Independence. He inherited the throne from his father Henry III, who had kind of let England fall into a fair amount of rebellion. He hadn't exercised control. Edward I came in and he was just badass. He took over. He shut down all the rebellions. He took over Wales and make it part of the English crown. He's also portrayed as definitely being the bad guy. he banished all the Jews from England and things like that. Anyway, this continues for a while, and John Balliol as king, well, at some point it is seen to be important to get some alliances going, I guess, and they enter into Scotland enters into an alliance with France, the Auld Alliance, and this is seen by the English as being a traitorous move. Edward basically strips John Balliol of his royal heraldry, kicks him out, banishes him to France, and then takes over Scotland by force. And this is the point where Braveheart basically happens, right? William Wallace forms a minor rebellion. He he wins a bunch of battles, becomes Guardian of Scotland for a few years, and then is defeated. He is ultimately captured and executed for treason, despite the fact that he never pledged allegiance to Edward I. Anyway, it would be a few years. Edward I would die, Edward II would come to power, and he wasn't nearly the man that his father was. And this opportunity was essentially seized upon by Robert the Bruce, who managed to rally the troops, put together an army, and force the English out of Scotland. And finally, he became King of Scotland. And that would remain that way for many years. The Pope would recognise Scotland as a legitimate monarchy, and that meant that invading it through force would have the potential to upset the Pope and therefore have the rest of Europe fighting you. So Scotland was a bit more secure at that point. Now, a couple of centuries later, in England, you have the War of the Roses. Now, the War of the Roses is a really, awesome part of history. And if you know about Game of Thrones, you might have heard the author comment that he's based the notion of many of the kind of political infighting and battles and everything on what happened during the War of the Roses. Now, at the end of the War of the Roses, Henry VII manages to come out ahead, and he becomes king and immediately marries the most legitimate heiress on the other side, so therefore uniting the two houses. But when he has a daughter, basically having won the War of the Roses, he's still concerned about other pretenders to the throne, so he wants to squash any possible dissent. And he wants to make sure that they won't get any support. So he marries off his daughter, Margaret Tudor, to the King of Scotland at that time, right? James IV. And that's an interesting moment because it means that the English royal lines become part of the Scottish royal lines, although because the Scottish king with Scotland had a king, that meant the Scottish lineage actually has dominance. And this would matter a few decades later when Henry VIII, of course, ends up with 3 heirs and they would all die without having children. By the time Elizabeth first got on the throne, they were getting really concerned that there was no legitimate heirs, and James VI of Scotland is seen as the legitimate heir to the English throne. So the nobles take him kind of away as a young man. He was he ascended to the throne at the age of 1 when his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, was executed by Elizabeth for treason. So he's due to become king. So the English and the Scottish lords take him away and they train him to be king. And by train him to be king, what I mean is they raise him as a Protestant. A lot of the monarchistic problems, let's say, for that time period boil down to being Catholic or Protestant, because Henry VIII split away from the Pope so he could get divorced and remarry. And England is generally Protestant dominated, but Scotland still had a strong Catholic presence. So when Elizabeth dies, James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England. And at that point, Scotland and England, the crowns of Scotland and England are unified, right? And by unified, it doesn't mean the countries were unified. They were still very separate countries, but the crowns were both on James' head. So the monarchy was unified. And he actually wanted to make it, a stronger union. He wanted to create proper political ties between both nations, but it didn't go anywhere. The parliaments rejected this. So the next 100 years are kind of interesting. In England, what happens are Charles I is seen as being too much of an absolute monarch, and he is deposed and executed. Parliament takes control and creates the Commonwealth of Britain, right? So it becomes a republic, more or less, under Oliver Cromwell for about 10 years. Then he dies, and nobody is able to govern, so they bring back the king, right? So they have a revolution, depose the king, and then 10 years later they bring back the king, Charles II. Now, Charles II, does his stuff. Then his son, James II, well, James II is suspected of being Catholic, and then he has a male heir who is absolutely certainly going to be Catholic, and this is not going to fly. So when his heir comes to the throne, before his heir comes to the throne, there is a revolution that essentially deposes him and replaces him with William of Orange and Queen Mary II. So against this backdrop, they rule England. Mary's sister Anne then becomes queen, and she fails to produce an heir. So once again, you have a succession crisis. Now, during this era, Scotland has had a number of economic problems, let's say. In particular, they tried to found a colony in a place called Darien in Central America. They thought it would be a great trading location, but as it turned out, it was one of the most inhospitable places in the world, and the colony was a complete failure. This is also notable as being something like a precursor to Kickstarter, because the merchants of the era were unable to fund it on their own, so they went to kind of the middle classes and asked them to donate. And a lot of people in Scotland donated their life savings to this grand venture that would bring economic prosperity, and in fact only brought terrible disease to the colonists. Incidentally, Darien is so inhospitable that there's a road in America, the Pan American Highway, and the intention was that it should run the length of the continent. It starts up in like North Canada, Alaska, whatever, goes all the way down through Central America, and then it stops at Darien. It then continues on the other side all the way down to Argentina. People have managed to cross it in cars. There's one expedition that crossed it in a car, and they managed an average speed of 200 meters per hour. Right, it took them months. So yeah, not the best plan. Anyway, Scotland's kind of hurting, and they really want access to English markets. But with the succession crisis, they have a bargaining chip. They could choose a different successor to the throne. The English want their successor to the throne. In particular, they want a Protestant successor. They have actually passed a law that says that the monarchy can only pass to Protestant heirs. The only problem is there's 51 people in line before you actually get to a Protestant, and that would be George I of House Hanover. He is a German, but he is the one the English want. So this the Scottish, essentially, through agreements, they agree to make George their next king as well. And so that's basically when the union happens, right? It's when both countries, they agree to become the same. It's the act of the union. King George I comes to the throne. He is German, and but he becomes the next king of England. And I should point out that going back to James VI, who of course was when the Union kind of started, that was the case of not the English taking over Scotland, it was a case of Scotland taking over England. And practically all monarchs in Europe, in modern Europe, are descended from James VI, which is interesting. Now, going forward from that, pretty much straight after this union there's a period called the Scottish Enlightenment. That's where Scottish thinkers are world-class philosophers. We have David Hume and Adam Smith. A lot of the writings and stuff that came out of Scotland during that era they even inspired, the formation of the United States. It's a really fascinating period on Scotland. During the Scottish Illumination, a number of civil servants positions that get appointed in England seem to be going to Scottish people predominantly, and there's actually some discontent on the English side about this happening. The army really loves their Scottish troops because they're stronger and less likely to mutiny. That is their own words. Now, after the Scottish Enlightenment, Scottish contributions to science continue to be incredibly important. We have James Clerk Maxwell, and we have a whole bunch of inventions. James Watt invented the steam engine. We have a great period where Scotland is kind of the dominant power almost in Britain. Scottish industry becomes first and foremost. 25% of the ships in the world were getting built in Scotland. And so you have to realise that the union of England and Scotland and Wales and Ireland really had Scotland dominating the scene for centuries afterwards. It wasn't until the 20th century that there was a waning of that, let's say, as this industry moved, and Scotland replaced a lot of its exports with things like whiskey and services. I mean, hey, biggest video game of last year was Grand Theft Auto 5, and that is something that is Scottish. Yeah, our greatest cultural export is Grand Theft Auto. Sherlock Holmes, Jekyll and Hyde, all written by Scotsmen. Anyway, coming back to the question of the independence vote. Now, people are interested to know my position, and as I pointed out, I'm not a resident, I'm not eligible to vote, and I am unlikely to be affected by anything that comes from this. And so I believe that since people might be watching this thinking that it might affect their position, I'm purposely not going to take a position. I'm ambivalent, but I really want to make it clear that, don't take a position from anyone that doesn't have a vested interest in it. And if you're looking at the campaigns, realise that they are biased. Look at the headlines, they are biased. Do your own research, figure out what's going to go on. If you really want to get the opinion of a Manly who lives in Scotland, go back and look at my brother. He was in a video with me, a live stream, and he expressed an opinion, and I think it's valid that you might follow his, but I may not agree with him, and I may agree with him, but I'm not going to tell you. That's the important thing, because it's you to decide, and I want you all to vote when the time comes. I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.